Dead Games Ahoy! Today, it's been announced that Spellbreak is shutting down. We'll talk about the announcement and also what can be learned from the studio's mistakes and how it came to this. Now, Spellbreak, if you're not familiar with it, is a spell-focused third-person battle royale in its core, even though it had other game modes later as well. And it was released by Proletariat, a small studio that didn't really have any significant titles before that. The game had a few unique design choices and approaches to how you played it, and I think it's unfortunate that that is no longer available for us in the future. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, let's have a look at the announcement first. The first one is on their blog, and reads as follows. Breakers, after more than 4 years of elemental magic and spell combinations, we've made the decision to end development of Spellbreak. The servers will be shut down as of early 2023. Thank you for the millions of players who have joined us in the HoloLands since 2018. It's been an amazing journey. Our vision was to create a fresh multiplayer action spellcasting game with exceptional movement and class customization that would give players the chance to unleash their inner battle mage. We are grateful to everyone in the game's community for exploring the magical worlds and experiences we created together. Spellbreak was an ambitious project that saw our team push new boundaries in design and development, and we are excited to continue to innovate as we create new titles in the future. To all Spellbreak fans around the world, thank you for your support and dedication that made the game and community so special. In addition to that, Seth Sivak, the CEO of Proletariat, made another post on Reddit, a message to the Spellbreak community. Spellbreak started as an idea to create a revolutionary multiplayer fantasy experience. I feel we achieved that in combat, art style, storytelling, and more. When we started development on Spellbreak, we thought we would be lucky if we got an early access, PC-only release. The excitement and engagement from the community allowed us to push the boundaries on quality, gameplay, platforms, and more. Spellbreak was the first game ever released fully cross-platforms with crossplay on day one across PC, PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. Over 10 million players have dropped into the HoloLands, which is an incredible milestone for any new IP launching from any developer. It is challenging to sum up the experiences of both building Spellbreak and launching it into the world with the help of every single one of you. It is even more difficult to tell you that we'll be shutting down Spellbreak early next year. Unfortunately, the game industry is a difficult business. Spellbreak was not able to break through and reach a sustainable place where we would continue to invest in it in the way that we had dreamed of. We picked a hard path as an independent studio and decided to compete with some of the biggest games in the world. While we could not get the escape velocity needed, I do not regret the bold decision we made in bringing Spellbreak to life. While this is goodbye for Spellbreak, I cannot thank this community enough for the support and help along the way. Spellbreak transformed our studio and touched the lives of so many. So again, thank you. Now, first and foremost, these statements have to be put into context a little bit. This whole thing is happening after a very, very long radio silence. Spellbreak's Twitter account went quiet in last October. There were no more updates, there was no information for the players, they were basically left in the dark, and now, I would say almost out of nowhere this announcement comes, but then again, it's not really out of nowhere when the devs been quiet for so long, it just kinda is expected that it will happen eventually at that point. I imagine that during this time period they were trying to figure out ways to see if they could get funding for the game or anything else that would keep it alive, but obviously the community is not exactly reacting well to such a long lack of information just to get the inevitable downfall at the end. In light of Proletariat still developing games in the future, it would be smart to have a good line of communication with the players even when things are not looking rosy. With the reason for Spellbreak's shutdown, however, being relatively simple, it just didn't make enough money, let's talk about where the game went right and where it went wrong. One thing that stands out immediately is the visual design. I think especially the visual effects, the magic that was actually happening in the game, looked extremely cool. The cartoon style kind of worked for it, and I think that is one of those things that will definitely stay in my memory as what Spellbreak really was. It's just this flashy magic game, which had very vibrant and unique effects. On the topic of this very magic, I found the ability to combine different effects from your spells extremely interesting. They would interact with each other so that you could basically create super spells out of using two different spells or throwing one ability into another spell. And that was a very, very interesting format. I felt that at times it didn't go far enough. There could have been more frequent interactions between your two different spell gauntlets that you were holding and more possible combinations where you maybe just have a combined ability right away or something. But the overall idea was very cool, and it's something that you're not really seeing in many other games. Something else that Spellbreak did extremely well was movement. Movement is a very fundamental part of the combat at Spellbreak because a lot of avoiding abilities is simply about your in-air movement or your ground movement, and you had a variety of spells that could influence that in different ways, like flying up or teleporting. This also led to a variety of different playstyles where you had to adapt to how your enemy moves. The abilities in themselves were also unique, from ice slides to rock boulders and ground slams and what have you. There were plenty of powerful abilities that were distinctly unique from each other. Now, for all those things that Spellbreak did well, unfortunately there are quite a few things that didn't go so well either. The first one was the way the game was launched. It's great that it launched on all platforms, but really the start was pretty rocky. Initially there was only a 3v3 mode, with other modes just coming later down the road. This was especially bad because this was at a point where you had people who had been playing the game for years that had been in all the betas, and a bunch of new players coming in that would get rolled by them, and a lot of it was then group RNG if you would get one of those experienced players. The game also only launched with its Battle Royale mode. Considering how long the game had been in beta, they might as well have waited a little bit longer just to release a fully fleshed out version of the game, because the first impression for games is extremely important. When the game launched, that was when the game had the biggest hype and everyone tried it out, and either they're gonna enjoy it or not, so you want to make sure that the game is as enjoyable as possible for as many different players as possible at that very point, and that was just not the case. And on the topic of being enjoyable for as many players as possible, I thought it was a very bold approach for this game to only go for magic abilities. Now, if we look at any MMO, we look at any MOBA, anything else in that sphere where you have different roles, you typically have a significant portion of the player base that likes playing mages. And then you have people that like playing tankier characters or melee characters or ranged characters that don't rely on any form of spells or anything along those lines. And just going for one specific fantasy archetype, in my opinion, limited the player base more than necessary. I understand that in many ways the spells kind of replaced other roles and you had more close range roles and more distance focused roles, but I do believe that if they chose to simply introduce some form of knight maybe and a ranger or something of that sort, or maybe an assassin as a different playstyle that doesn't rely on the traditional spells, it could have made the game more appealing for a larger player base. Even if the playstyle wouldn't necessarily have been that fundamentally different from how the spells are used, just to not give the impression that everything in the game is just about spells. I think in order to be able to limit the game completely to players that like playing mages, you would have had to have a bigger developer behind it that can reach a larger player base, because you're just leaving out larger groups of players that may not be interested in traditional battle royales and could otherwise be interested in yours. And weirdly enough, while I praised some of the unique spells, a lot of the combat still felt very similar to gunplay. If this was a sci-fi game, many of the abilities could have been like just slightly redesigned in terms of visuals and what weapons are used to fire them. Like instead of having a poison spell, you have a poison grenade or something like that, and it would have worked exactly the same. So I think at times the game was trying to be too much of a shooter when it wasn't really necessary for the game to appeal to players. And while I earlier praised the visual effects of the game, I think that the art choice itself was good, but the environments and how the art style was used for it was relatively bland and repetitive. Most of the map was just castles and a few green hills and trees in between. It didn't look particularly special, and I think there could have been more that could have been done with it. And on the topic of doing more, the game did not really receive many major upgrades since launch. There were patches, there were updates, there were changes, but in terms of how the game overall looks and plays and how the environment that you're playing in is, not really all that much has changed. I watched a stream today and compared that directly to my recordings from launch. It visually, environmentally is barely changed from launch. There are some small UI elements that are different, and otherwise you could tell me it's exactly the same game, only that people know how to play it better now. Of course, that wouldn't be quite true. There are under the hood mechanics changes that are not that visual. But at the end of the day, especially with free-to-play battle royales, the expectation is that things frequently change and freshen up in some way and just constantly have some updates to the game that make the gameplay just slightly different in order to feel like you're not playing the same map situation over and over and over. And I feel like Spellbreak didn't really cover that. All in all, I think Spellbreak is a game that had decent potential, but was limited by its strong focus on being Battle Royale, on its many mistakes that were happening in the early phases of releasing the game, and also on limiting the game in terms of scope to basically just having mages. I recommend trying it at least once before the servers shut down and get a feel for the movement mechanics, because that was pretty cool, but at the same time, it's not exactly like gigantic for me where I will massively miss this game forever. I'm also curious to see what the developers come up with next. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And other than that, I thank you for watching and hope to see you for the next one soon. SLOTH, out.